I am thrilled that we've only lost 4 banks. Moreover, the 4 banks that we've lost were non-standard. All of them were tech banks, and tech banks work differently. Throughout the rest of the system, people raise capital either by taking out loans or issuing stock. That's not how it works in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is primarily driven by venture capital, and you get your cash mostly in lump sums. So what the people who run the startups do is they take that lump sum, they park it in a bank, and then they just draw upon it as they need it for payroll and costs and resources and everything else. What happened with the 4 banks that went under is the depositors got spooked and they yanked their capital. Well, the banks had just basically put all of that capital into things like government debt, and they couldn't liquidate fast enough. And then when they did liquidate, they had no assets. So it was a very, very non-standard bank run. Normally what happens is you get loans that go bad for a bank, and then the bank runs out of operating capital and people pull their money out and you get a collapse. That hasn't happened anywhere. So to quintuple the cost of capital in the United States in under a year, the fastest increase in capital costs in American history, and only have 4 banks using a non-standard metric and business model, only have 4 go down, I feel pretty good about this. And I think the Fed does too. Now, when the Fed looks has done in order to rein in inflation, I think they're pretty pleased with themselves. We only really have 2 sectors in a lot of pressure. Housing, because it's driven by interest rates and mortgage rates, and tech, because it's risen by capital. But tech was already on its way down because of the labor situation. And housing is an unfortunate side effect of what's going on, because we really do need several million more housing units. But ultimately, the Fed is not overly concerned about what it sees. I phrased that wrong. The Fed is very concerned about tech. They're even more concerned about housing, but they don't consider that the real problem. The real problem is demographics, because while the United States still has a positive demographic profile, most of the advanced world doesn't. And what is monetary policy? What are interest rates? Except a series of tools that are designed to regulate consumption. You want more consumption in order to get inflation up, you lower capital costs by lowering interest rates. You're concerned that inflation is running too fast, you raise interest rates to tamp down demand and get inflation under control. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. Well, with Germany and Italy and China and Japan and Korea and the rest aging out, they will never have consumption-driven economic growth again. And so the Fed isn't so much worried about this economic cycle. The Fed is worried about the next one. When the United States, and to a lesser degree Mexico and Canada, are the only economies in the world that are capable of responding to monetary policy. The Fed isn't worried about this cycle, it's worried about the next one. Because if it knows that if it does not have enough dry powder to stimulate demand at the next time around, then that's it. The rest of the world will never recover, and the United States will at best fall into a Japanese-style malaise where economic growth is 0 in a good year. So the Fed needs as much dry powder as it can possibly get. They're not going to stop before 6%. They would really like to reach 9 because they're worried about the monster that's chewing on the horizon. If they get this wrong, if they don't have enough tools, we will not see economic growth for at least a generation. And that is something that is a far worse situation than the inflation environment that we're seeing right now. All right, so the key thing to remember about Russia, it's not a normal nation state, it's a multi-ethnic empire. And the political system that evolves from that is nothing like what we're familiar with here in the United States when it comes to elections or accountability. I mean, our system is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but Russia really only has 2 options for ruling its territory. One is strict military dictatorship, like we saw under the Soviet Union. And the other one is the more czarist issue or style of balancing various forces. So for that to work, the czarist strategy, it is very dependent upon the personality and the mediation skills of the leader himself. Now, in the case of Putin, Putin comes from St. Petersburg, and the people who are ruling the country right now are his cadre back from when he was vice mayor in Petersburg back in the 90s. And in that era, what Putin discovered personally is that the most reliable tools in order to force the population to do what you want were organized crime, because you could call upon them to assassinate people who were problematic, to extort folks, to keep problems in line, to keep the foreigners at arm's length, all that good stuff. And so that entire constellation of people that he used in Petersburg are now the folks that are running Moscow. Now, there are other political and economic factions throughout the Russian Federation, a lot of them headquartered in Moscow, and they don't really overly care for this setup. And that has made it difficult for Putin to exercise control over the military in the same way that, say, the Soviet Union did. So what he did is the logical thing. He took one of his people from St. Petersburg, a guy by the name of Shoigu, and put it in charge of the overall national military. Shoigu is great at manipulating organized crime, and he's probably the most corrupt person alive on the planet right now. In fact, best guess is that 1/3 of the defense budget for procurement for weapons and modernization, he skimmed off the top for him personally, and then the people under him took another third for themselves. One of the reasons why Russian equipment is not doing as well as we would have expected it to do, and one of the reasons why the Indians are in the process of backing out of all of their arms supply contracts, because they realize that Shoigu just stole all the development money and they're never going to get what they've already paid for. Okay, so you play that forward to today's environment. This is not a government that has a hierarchical system of control throughout all of society. You've got a guy at the top who has established himself as the ultimate arbiter to negotiate among the factions. And in order to get a little bit more flexibility, Putin personally created what we now know as Wagner to create a new faction that was loyal only to him. Well, like any other factional system, the factions rub up against each other. And in Ukraine, Wagner and the Ministry of Defense under Shoigu came into direct conflict. And so Prigozhin, who's the leader of Wagner, basically threw his coup in an attempt to force Putin to choose him over Shoigu, to elevate his faction and push down Shoigu's. What Prigozhin failed to account for is that Shoigu is not simply a crony of Putin. He's a really good friend. The two of them go back to their time in East Germany when Putin's job was to steal technology from the West, and they're godfathers to each other's children. So it was probably unwise of him to ever attempt this, and it's probably going to cost him his life before the end of the year. And we're already seeing a purge of the entire faction of Wagner. We confirmed that a number of the military leaders of Wagner at its various bases and operations around the world have already been detained, and in many cases already shipped back to Russia. We'll probably never hear from them again. Wagner itself is being dismantled. The people who are personally loyal to Prigozhin have already relocated to Belarus, but it's not enough to make it a functional military force, and the rest of it's either going to be disbanded and or folded back into the regular Russian military. So that faction is being completely folded up. But the important thing for the future of Russia is this. When Prigozhin made his play, not a single leader of any of the dozens of factions in Russia supported him. But when he made his run on Moscow, not a single Russian soldier stood against him. Putin is the manager at the top, but he commands nothing. And so we have gotten more insight into the real power dynamics of the Russian Federation in the last week than we got in the last 22 years. And it looks really, really bad, because it doesn't take much disruption, as we've just seen, for one faction to overturn everything that Putin has done in the last 20 years. So the question now is, what's the next shock? Because now all of the leaders of all of the other factions realize just how brittle the situation is. The last time this happened in Russian history, it was 1600